The eviction notice trembled in his weathered hands. 3 days. That's all Derek Sullivan had given him. 3 days to pack up a life, to abandon the only stability he'd found since coming home from Kandahar. But what Derek didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand as he smirked behind his polished desk, was that some battles don't end when you think they do. Some soldiers carry more than just scars. And some fights are worth everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Texas heat pressed down on Austin like a suffocating blanket, turning the asphalt of Riverside Gardens apartment complex into a shimmering mirage. The kind of heat that made tempers short and patience thin. It was July 15th, and the air conditioning had been broken in Building C for 6 days straight. 6 days of residents calling the management office. 6 days of promises that never materialized. 6 days of watching elderly neighbors wilt in their units, while Derek Sullivan found every excuse in the book to delay repairs. Marcus Thompson stood in the shadow of the building's overhang, his service-worn boots planted firmly on concrete that radiated heat like a griddle. At 34, Mac carried himself with the measured precision of someone who'd learned to be watchful, to read situations before they read him. His brown hair was cropped close, silver threading through at the temples in a way that spoke of stress rather than age. The sleeves of his faded blue work shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with the kind of scars that came from places most people only saw on the news. He'd been waiting outside the management office for 47 minutes. Not that he was counting out of impatience, but because precision had kept him alive for 3 tours in Afghanistan, and old habits carved themselves deep into a man's bones. The appointment had been scheduled for 2 o'clock. Derek Sullivan's assistant, Chad Brennan, had confirmed it twice over the phone, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved for tenants who dared to make requests. The management office sat at the heart of the complex like a fortress of administrative power, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. Inside, Mac could see figures moving behind the glass, the outline of Derek Sullivan gesturing animatedly at someone just out of view. Sullivan was a man who wore authority like an expensive suit, tailored to impress but hollow where it counted. At 42, he'd never worn a uniform that meant anything. Never slept on ground that wanted to kill him, never made decisions where the wrong choice meant someone didn't come home. Mac's phone buzzed against his hip. A text from Mrs. Elena Rodriguez in Unit 251B. Mijo, my grandson is coming to visit this weekend, but I can't let him stay in this heat. Can you help me talk to the office? Elena was 73, a retired schoolteacher who'd spent 40 years shaping young minds in East Austin. She'd been the first neighbor to welcome Mac when he'd moved in 8 months ago, showing up at his door with homemade tamales and the kind of smile that reminded him what he'd been fighting for overseas. The complex buzzed with the quiet desperation of people trying to cope. Jimmy Kowalski, the maintenance supervisor, had been running himself ragged trying to patch emergency cooling solutions with box fans and prayers. Mac had watched him yesterday, sweat-soaked and frustrated, explaining to a cluster of residents that he'd submitted the work orders 6 times, but parts kept getting delayed, budgets kept getting questioned, and priorities kept getting reshuffled. Through the office window, Mac caught sight of Ashley Morgan, the leasing agent, shaking her head at something on her computer screen. Ashley was 26, fresh out of college, with a degree in business administration and dreams that hadn't yet been ground down by corporate reality. She'd confided in Mac during a chance encounter at the mailboxes that she'd been advocating for emergency repairs, but Derek had shut down every proposal that required spending more than pocket change. The office door finally opened with a sharp chime, and Chad Brennan emerged, his polo shirt pristine despite the oppressive heat. Chad was Derek's shadow, a 28-year-old assistant manager who'd learned to mirror his boss's disdain for tenants who caused what they euphemistically called administrative friction. His blonde hair was gelled into submission, and his eyes held the particular smugness of someone who'd never been truly tested by life. "Mr. Thompson," Chad announced, his voice carrying across the small waiting area with theatrical formality. "Mr. Sullivan will see you now, but he's got a conference call in 15 minutes, so let's keep this brief." Mac followed Chad into the office, his boots silent on the polished tile floor. The interior was a study in corporate sterility, all neutral colors and motivational posters about teamwork and excellence. Derek Sullivan sat behind an imposing desk that seemed designed to create distance between himself and anyone seeking his attention. The nameplate read Derek J. Sullivan, Property Manager, the brass polished to a mirror shine that reflected the overhead fluorescent lights. Derek was the kind of man who cultivated an image of success through accessories. His watch was expensive, but not quite expensive enough to be impressive. His suit was tailored, but showed wear at the seams, and his confidence was the brittle variety that cracked under real pressure. He'd built his authority on the foundation of a company hierarchy that protected him from consequences, surrounded himself with people who wouldn't challenge his decisions, and learned to mistake compliance for respect. "Mr. Thompson," Derek said, without looking up from his computer screen, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with deliberate slowness. "I understand you have concerns about the air conditioning situation in Building C." Mac remained standing, despite the empty chair positioned directly across from Derek's desk. "6 days without cooling, Mr. Sullivan. We've got elderly residents, families with young children, people with medical conditions. This isn't just a convenience issue." Derek finally looked up, his pale blue eyes conducting a quick assessment that missed every detail that mattered. He saw a tenant, a problem to be managed, a voice to be pacified or silenced. He didn't see the Purple Heart recipient, the man who'd carried wounded soldiers through insurgent fight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fire, the neighbor who'd been checking on Elena Rodriguez twice daily to make sure she was managing the heat. "I appreciate your concern," Derek said, the words carefully chosen to sound sympathetic while conveying nothing resembling actual empathy. "But these situations are more complex than they appear. We're dealing with supply chain issues, contractor availability, budget approvals from corporate. These things take time." Chad nodded along from his position near the door, his expression suggesting that Mac should be grateful for such a thorough explanation. Behind Derek's desk, a small personal air conditioning unit hummed quietly, keeping the office at a comfortable 72 degrees while the rest of Building C sweltered in 90-degree heat. Mac kept his voice level, drawing on years of military discipline that had taught him to remain calm under pressure. "Jimmy Kowalski says the parts have been available for ordering since day 2. The delay seems to be an authorization, not availability." Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his professional facade. Nobody liked having their authority questioned, especially by someone they viewed as beneath their station. "Mr. Thompson, I hardly think you're qualified to assess our maintenance procedures." Jimmy sometimes gets ahead of himself with recommendations that don't account for the bigger picture. The dismissal hung in the air like smoke, acrid and revealing. Mac had heard variations of this speech before, in different contexts, from different men who wielded small power over others' lives. The assumption that a tenant couldn't possibly understand complex decisions, the suggestion that concern for neighbors was somehow naive, the subtle degradation of Jimmy Kowalski's professional competence. "The bigger picture," Mac repeated quietly, testing the phrase like he might test the strength of a rope before trusting his weight to it. "Help me understand what bigger picture justifies letting a 73-year-old woman suffer through this heat." Derek's smile was thin and sharp, the expression of someone who decided that patience was no longer required. "Mr. Thompson, I think you're being a bit dramatic. Mrs. Rodriguez has lived in Texas her entire life. I'm sure she's handled hot weather before. And frankly, if residents aren't satisfied with the level of service here at Riverside Gardens, they're always free to explore other housing options." The threat was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to wielding eviction as a weapon. Derek had perfected the art of the implicit ultimatum, never quite crossing the line into actionable harassment, while making his position crystal clear. Complain too much, advocate too loudly, and your lease renewal might face unexpected complications. Chad stepped forward slightly, his body language suggesting that the meeting had reached its natural conclusion. Mr. Thompson, we really do appreciate your feedback. We'll certainly take your concerns under advisement as we continue working through this challenging situation. Max studied both men for a long moment, reading their expressions the way he'd once read terrain for potential threats. Derek's confidence was built on a foundation of perceived powerlessness in others, the assumption that tenants had no choice but to accept whatever conditions he deemed acceptable. Chad's smugness reflected his role as an amplifier of Derek's authority, someone who derived his sense of importance from proximity to power rather than possession of it. "I see," Max said finally, his voice carrying a weight that neither Derek nor Chad quite understood. "So the plan is to continue doing nothing while people suffer, and if anyone objects, they can find somewhere else to live." Derek leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting that Mac had finally grasped the reality of the situation. "Mr. Thompson, this is a business, not a charity. We provide housing at competitive market rates, and we address maintenance issues according to established procedures and priorities. If you're not satisfied with those procedures, then perhaps Riverside Gardens isn't the right fit for your lifestyle." The words settled between them like a gauntlet thrown down on ancient ground. Derek had made his position clear. He held all the cards, controlled all the outcomes, and expected compliance without question. He'd built his authority on the assumption that tenants were isolated, powerless, and ultimately disposable. Mac reached into his back pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn smooth at the edges from handling. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, his movements carrying the precision of someone accustomed to handling important documents under pressure. The paper was his lease agreement, but tucked inside it was something else, something Derek's eyes couldn't quite make out in the fluorescent lighting. "I'll keep that in mind," Max said, his voice carrying a tone that made Chad shift uncomfortably near the door. "Just so we're clear on the record, you're refusing to authorize emergency repairs for a building full of elderly residents and families during a heat wave that's already sent 3 people to the hospital this week." Derek's expression flickered, the first sign that Mac's words carried implications he hadn't anticipated. The mention of hospitalizations, of official records, of accountability beyond the insular world of property management procedures. "I wouldn't characterize it as refusing, Mr. Thompson. We're following established protocols for maintenance requests. Protocols that prioritize budget concerns over human welfare," Max said. Not a question, but a statement that hung in the air like an accusation. The office fell silent except for the quiet hum of Derek's personal air conditioning unit and the distant sound of children playing in the courtyard, their voices carrying the particular exhaustion of kids trying to have fun in oppressive heat. Through the window, Mac could see Jimmy Kowalski loading box fans onto a cart, preparing for another round of inadequate emergency cooling measures. Derek stood up from his desk, his movement sharp and final. "Mr. Thompson, I think we've covered the relevant points of your concern. As I mentioned, I have a conference call starting shortly. Chad will show you out." But Mac didn't move. He remained standing in front of Derek's desk, his presence somehow larger than his physical frame, his stillness suggesting the kind of patience that comes from experience with situations where moving too quickly could prove fatal. He was looking at Derek with an expression that was neither hostile nor deferential, but something else entirely, something that made Derek's confident smile waver at the edges. "Actually," Max said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the office, "I think we're just getting started." The words settled in the room like dust after an explosion, and for the first time since the meeting began, Derek Sullivan looked uncertain about who was really in control. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, Derek's uncertainty growing with each passing second. Mac Thompson stood motionless, his weathered hands now resting at his sides, the folded lease agreement still visible in his grip. There was something in his posture that Derek couldn't quite identify, a quality that suggested Mac was accustomed to situations where stillness meant survival, and hasty decisions meant consequences. Mac's eyes moved slowly around the office, taking in details with the methodical precision of someone conducting reconnaissance. The expensive desk accessories that spoke of vanity rather than function. The motivational posters that preached excellence while surrounded by evidence of mediocrity. The small refrigerator humming in the corner, stocked with bottled water while residents upstairs rationed fluids to cope with the heat. Most telling of all was the personal air conditioning unit, its quiet efficiency a testament to Derek's comfort while his tenants suffered. The scars on Mac's forearms caught the fluorescent light as he shifted slightly, revealing patterns that spoke of stories Derek couldn't begin to comprehend. There was one that ran from his left wrist toward his elbow, thin and precise like a surgical incision but with the irregular edges that suggested field medicine rather than hospital care. Another marked his right forearm, a star-shaped pucker of skin that spoke of shrapnel and decisions made under fire. Chad cleared his throat nervously, his earlier confidence evaporating in the face of Mac's unwavering presence. The assistant manager had dealt with angry tenants before, people who shouted and threatened and ultimately backed down when faced with the reality of their powerlessness. But Mac wasn't angry, at least not in any way that Chad recognized. His calm was deeper than patience, more unsettling than rage. Derek attempted to reassert control, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd perfected for dealing with what he considered problem tenants. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. This meeting is over, and as I mentioned, I have other obligations." Mac reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small notebook, its black cover worn smooth from handling. The pages were filled with precise handwriting, timestamps, dates, names, and observations recorded with military attention to detail. He flipped through several pages before finding what he was looking for, his finger tracing a line of text that made Derek's confident expression falter. "July 9th, Mac read aloud, his voice carrying the neutral tone of someone reciting facts rather than making accusations. "First report of air conditioning failure in Building C maintenance request, submitted by Jimmy Kowalski at 0830 hours. July 10th, follow-up request with vendor recommendations and cost estimates. July 11th, residents' petition delivered to this office with 43 signatures requesting emergency repairs." Derek's face tightened as Mac continued reading, each entry a precise documentation of negligence and delay. Chad shifted uncomfortably near the door, suddenly aware that their casual dismissal of tenant concerns had been observed and recorded by someone who understood the value of evidence. "July 12th, Mac continued. Mrs. Rodriguez called emergency services due to heat-related distress. Paramedics responded to Unit 251B at 1400 hours. July 13th, Mr. and Mrs. Chen in Unit 245A relocated their infant daughter to relatives' home due to unsafe conditions. July 14th, yesterday, Maintenance Supervisor Jimmy Kowalski submitted urgent request for authorization to proceed with emergency repairs at owner's expense." The notebook snapped shut with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Mac looked up from the pages, his dark eyes meeting Derek's with an intensity that made the property manager take an involuntary step backward. 43 signatures, Mac repeated quietly. 43 people asking for help, including elderly residents, families with children, people with medical conditions that make heat dangerous. And your response has been to delay, deflect, and threaten anyone who asks questions. Derek's mouth opened to respond, but no words emerged. The careful documentation, the precise timestamps, the methodical recording of every failure and delay had transformed what he'd viewed as isolated complaints into a pattern of institutional negligence. Worse, it suggested that Mac Thompson was not the simple tenant Derek had assumed him to be. Ashley Morgan appeared in the doorway behind Chad, her expression troubled as she caught fragments of the conversation. She'd been watching the confrontation through the office's interior window, and something in Mac's demeanor had triggered recognition, though she couldn't quite place what it was. There was a quality to his movements, a way of carrying himself that reminded her of her brother Jake, who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before returning home, changed in ways that took years to understand. "Mr. Sullivan, Ashley said carefully. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Rodriguez called. She's asking if we can at least provide some industrial fans for the elderly residents on the upper floors. The heat index is supposed to reach 108 degrees tomorrow." Derek turned toward Ashley with visible irritation, his authority being questioned from multiple directions simultaneously. "Ashley, we've discussed this. Emergency expenditures require corporate approval, and corporate requires documented justification through proper channels." Mac's voice cut through Derek's explanation like a blade through fabric. "How much?" Derek blinked, momentarily thrown by the directness of the question. "Excuse me?" "The emergency repairs," Mac clarified, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "How much would it cost to fix the air conditioning system today?" Chad fumbled with a folder on his desk, pulling out a maintenance estimate that had been gathering dust for 3 days. The quote from the HVAC contractor is $3,200 for parts and labor. "But that doesn't include $3,200, Mac repeated, letting the figure hang in the air. "To restore cooling to 47 units housing 112 residents, including 18 children and 26 seniors." Derek's face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and defensive anger. "It's not just about the money, Mr. Thompson. There are procedures, protocols, liability considerations. We can't just throw money at every problem without proper oversight." Mac opened his notebook again, flipping to a different section filled with financial calculations and research notes. "The daily revenue from Building C alone is approximately $4,000. The cost of emergency repairs represents less than 1 day's rent collection from the affected units." The precision of Mac's financial analysis caught Derek off guard. This wasn't a tenant making emotional appeals or vague demands for action. This was someone who understood numbers, systems, and the economic realities that drove property management decisions. Someone who'd done his homework, with the thoroughness of a person accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on accurate intelligence. "Furthermore," Mac continued, his voice remaining level despite the increasing tension in the room, "Texas Property Code Section 92.056 requires landlords to make diligent efforts to repair or remedy conditions that materially affect the physical health or safety of ordinary tenants. The current heat index, combined with the lack of air conditioning, creates conditions that meet the legal definition of habitability violations." Derek's confidence cracked visibly. The casual mention of specific legal statutes, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone familiar with regulatory frameworks, suggested that Mac's knowledge extended far beyond typical tenant awareness. Chad glanced nervously between Derek and Mac, suddenly aware that they might be facing someone with resources and expertise they hadn't anticipated. Ashley stepped further into the office, her expression growing more troubled as she absorbed the implications of the conversation. "Mr. Sullivan, if there are actual habitability violations, shouldn't we—" "Ashley," Derek interrupted sharply, "I think you have other responsibilities to attend to." But Ashley didn't retreat. Instead, she looked directly at Mac, her voice careful but determined. "Mr. Thompson, you mentioned Mrs. Rodriguez had a medical emergency. Is she okay?" Mac's expression softened slightly as he turned toward Ashley, recognizing someone who genuinely cared about the residents rather than simply managing them as revenue sources. "She's stable, but the paramedics were concerned about dehydration and heat stress. They recommended she relocate to a cooler environment, but she doesn't have anywhere else to go." The human cost of Derek's delays suddenly became personal rather than abstract. Ashley had processed Mrs. Rodriguez's lease application 8 months earlier, had heard stories about her 40 years of teaching, had seen the photos of grandchildren that covered her kitchen table. The thought of this sweet elderly woman suffering because of administrative foot-dragging sparked something that Derek's corporate policies hadn't managed to extinguish. "There has to be something we can do," Ashley said, her voice stronger now despite Derek's warning glare. "We can't just let people suffer while we wait for corporate approval." Derek's authority was being eroded from multiple directions, his carefully constructed hierarchy of power challenged by a tenant who'd come prepared, and an employee who'd found her conscience. He attempted to reassert control through the only means he understood: intimidation and the threat of consequences. "Ashley, I'm going to remind you that your employment here depends on following company policies, not making unauthorized commitments to residents. And Mr. Thompson, I'm going to have to ask you one final time to leave this office. If you continue to disrupt our operations, I'll have no choice but to contact security." Mac closed his notebook and returned it to his shirt pocket, his movements deliberate and unhurried. When he looked up at Derek, his expression carried a weight that made the property manager's threats seem hollow and impotent. "Mr. Sullivan," Mac said quietly, "I want you to understand something very clearly. I'm not here to disrupt your operations. I'm here to ensure that the people in this building receive the basic human dignity they're paying for. The choice of how that happens is entirely yours." The words carried an undertone that Derek couldn't quite interpret, a suggestion of alternatives that hadn't been explicitly stated. Mac's calm certainty suggested someone accustomed to achieving objectives through various means, someone who understood that official channels were just one option among many. Chad's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen before looking up with visible relief. "Mr. Sullivan, your conference call is starting in 2 minutes." Derek seized on the interruption as an escape route from a conversation that had spiraled beyond his control. "Mr. Thompson, this discussion is over. I have other obligations and you've taken up enough of our time. Chad will escort you out." But as Derek moved toward his desk to begin his conference call, Mac remained standing in the center of the office. His presence seemed to fill the space in a way that made Derek's expensive furniture and corporate decorations appear cheap and insubstantial. "Actually," Mac said, his voice carrying across the room with quiet authority, "I think I'll wait." Derek froze mid-reach for his phone, confusion replacing his earlier attempts at dominance. Wait for what? Mac's smile was subtle, but unmistakable, the expression of someone who'd been holding cards that others hadn't known existed. "For you to make the right choice." The office fell silent except for the humming of Derek's personal air conditioning unit and the distant sounds of the complex's daily life filtering through the windows. Outside, Jimmy Kowalski could be seen loading another cart with emergency fans, his movements showing the exhaustion of someone fighting a losing battle against institutional indifference. Derek's phone began ringing, the sharp sound cutting through the tension like an alarm. His conference call was beginning, important people were waiting, and his carefully managed schedule was being disrupted by a tenant who refused to accept his place in the hierarchy. Everything about the situation should have reinforced Derek's authority, should have given him leverage to end this confrontation on his terms. Instead, he found himself hesitating, his hand hovering over the phone as he stared at Mac Thompson. There was something in the veteran's calm certainty that suggested this was far from over, that walking away now would simply delay a reckoning rather than avoid it. The phone continued ringing, its insistent tone marking each second of Derek's indecision. Ashley watched from the doorway, her loyalty torn between company policies and basic human decency. Chad shifted nervously, his earlier smugness replaced by growing uncertainty about how this situation would resolve. And Mac simply waited, his presence as steady and immovable as stone, his dark eyes holding Derek's gaze with the patience of someone who understood that some battles are won not through force, but through the relentless application of truth. The conference call went to voicemail. Derek Sullivan had built his authority on the assumption that tenants were powerless, that complaints could be deflected through bureaucratic processes, and that persistence would eventually yield to institutional indifference. But as he stared across his office at Mac Thompson, Derek began to suspect that all of his assumptions might be dangerously wrong. The afternoon heat pressed against the office windows like a living thing, distorting the view of the courtyard where children played listlessly in whatever shade they could find. The broken air conditioning in Building C wasn't just a maintenance issue anymore. It had become a test of will, a confrontation between those who held official power and those who carried something deeper, something that couldn't be dismissed with corporate policies or threatened with eviction notices. Mac reached into his back pocket and withdrew the folded lease agreement again, but this time he unfolded it completely, revealing what he'd kept hidden during the earlier part of their conversation. Tucked inside the standard rental documents was a second set of papers, official-looking documents with government seals and signatures that made Derek's eyes widen with sudden recognition. "Mr. Sullivan," Max said, his voice carrying a new edge that made both Derek and Chad straighten involuntarily. "I think it's time we discuss this situation from a different perspective." The transformation in Max's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The deferential tenant seeking help had been replaced by someone else entirely. Someone whose authority didn't derive from corporate hierarchies or management positions, but from something deeper and more substantial. The quiet confidence that Derek had mistaken for stubbornness revealed itself as the calm certainty of someone accustomed to responsibility and accountability in their most serious forms. Derek's mouth went dry as his brain processed the implications of what he was seeing. The official documents, the precise record-keeping, the detailed knowledge of legal statutes, the way Mac carried himself with unconscious authority. All of it suddenly coalesced into a picture that Derek desperately didn't want to see clearly. "Who are you?" Derek whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. Mac's response was quiet, measured, and delivered, with the kind of certainty that rearranged the fundamental dynamics of power in the room. "Someone who takes care of people," Mac said simply. "And right now, the people in Building C need taking care of." The words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise combined. Derek's comfortable world of tenant management and corporate protocols suddenly felt very small and very vulnerable. His personal air conditioning unit hummed quietly in the corner, a stark reminder of the choices he'd made and the suffering he'd ignored. Outside the office windows, the Texas heat continued its relentless assault on Riverside Gardens apartment complex. But inside Derek Sullivan's climate-controlled office, the temperature had just dropped considerably, and the balance of power had shifted in ways that would change everything that came next. Ashley stepped fully into the office now, her earlier hesitation replaced by growing recognition of something significant unfolding. Chad remained frozen near the door, his role as Derek's enforcer suddenly seeming inadequate for the situation developing before them. And Mac Thompson stood quietly at the center of it all, patient as stone and just as immovable, waiting for Derek Sullivan to understand that some responsibilities couldn't be delegated, some suffering couldn't be ignored, and some people carried authority that transcended any corporate organizational chart. The real confrontation was just beginning. The silence that followed Mac's revelation stretched through the management office like a slow-spreading stain. Derek Sullivan stared at the official documents in Mac's hands, his brain struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. The government seals were unmistakable, the formatting precise and authentic in a way that no amount of wishful thinking could dismiss. These weren't photocopies or internet downloads. These were original documents, signed by people whose names carried weight in corridors of power that Derek had never imagined entering. Ashley Morgan stepped closer, her curiosity overriding the caution that Derek's earlier warnings had instilled. From her position near the desk, she could make out fragments of official letterhead, military insignia, and classification markings that spoke of a world far removed from property management and tenant relations. Her brother Jake had shown her similar documents once, discharge papers and commendations that carried the weight of service and sacrifice in places most civilians only knew from news reports. Chad Brennan remained frozen near the door, his earlier smugness replaced by the dawning awareness that he might have fundamentally misunderstood the situation unfolding before him. The confident dismissal of what he'd assumed was just another complaining tenant now seemed not just inappropriate but potentially catastrophic. His hand moved unconsciously toward his phone, though he had no idea who he might call or what he might say to explain how a routine tenant meeting had transformed into something that felt like a military briefing. Mac allowed them time to absorb what they were seeing, his patience reflecting years of experience with situations where information needed to be processed carefully before decisions could be made. The documents in his hands represented more than just his personal history. They were evidence of systems and structures that operated according to principles Derek Sullivan had never encountered in his world of corporate hierarchies and profit margins. The first document was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with military paperwork: an honorable discharge certificate from the United States Army. signed by officials whose authority derived from institutions older and more substantial than any property management company. But it was the second document that made Derek's hands tremble slightly as he tried to focus on the text. A letter of commendation bearing the seal of the Department of Defense, signed by a colonel whose name Derek didn't recognize but whose authority was undeniable. Afghanistan, Max said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of memories that most people would never have to bear. 3 tours. First as a staff sergeant with the 10th Mountain Division, then as a senior non-commissioned officer with a special operations unit that doesn't appear on most organizational charts. The words settled in the office like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of understanding that expanded far beyond their immediate context. Ashley's recognition became complete as she processed what Mac was telling them. Her brother's stories, the ones he'd been willing to share, had hinted at the existence of soldiers who operated in the spaces between official missions, people whose service records were deliberately obscured to protect operations that required deniability. Derek's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his usual arsenal of dismissive responses rendered useless by the reality confronting him. The man he'd been treating as a problem tenant, someone to be managed through corporate policies and veiled threats, was revealing himself to be something entirely different. The scars on Mac's arms suddenly took on new meaning, no longer just marks of past misfortune, but evidence of service, rendered in places where mistakes meant death, and decisions carried consequences that echoed across continents. The third document was what made Chad finally understand why Mac's presence had felt so unsettling from the beginning. A certificate of appreciation from the Department of Veterans Affairs, recognizing outstanding service in veteran advocacy and community leadership. The language was formal and bureaucratic, but the implications were clear. Mac Thompson wasn't just a former soldier trying to navigate civilian life. He was someone who'd made it his mission to ensure that other veterans received the support and respect their service had earned. Mac folded the documents carefully and returned them to his pocket, his movements deliberate and respectful toward papers that represented years of his life and the lives of people who hadn't made it home. When he looked up at Derek again, his expression had changed subtly. The patient tenant seeking help had been replaced by someone else entirely, someone whose authority derived from sources that transcended any corporate organizational chart. "The reason I'm showing you this," Mac said, his voice carrying a new edge that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously, "isn't to intimidate you or to claim special treatment. It's to help you understand that when I see people suffering unnecessarily, when I see institutions failing to meet their basic responsibilities to the people they're supposed to serve, it triggers responses that go deeper than personal inconvenience." Derek finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "What do you want?" The question hung in the air like a surrender flag Derek's earlier bravado completely abandoned in favor of damage control. His comfortable assumptions about tenant management and corporate authority had been shattered by the revelation that Mac Thompson carried credentials that placed him far outside the normal hierarchy of property management relationships. Mac's response was immediate and uncompromising. "I want you to authorize the emergency repairs for Building C. I want you to ensure that Mrs. Rodriguez and the other vulnerable residents receive the care they deserve. And I want you to understand that this conversation doesn't end when I leave this office." The implicit threat was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who understood leverage and wasn't afraid to use it. Derek's mind raced through potential scenarios, none of them favorable to his continued employment or professional reputation. The idea of a decorated combat veteran documenting neglect and filing complaints with federal agencies was the kind of nightmare that kept property management companies awake at night. Ashley cleared her throat, her voice careful but determined. "Mr. Sullivan, if we authorize the emergency repairs now, we can have the systems operational by tomorrow morning. Jimmy's been ready to proceed for days." Derek turned toward Ashley with visible desperation, seeking any alternative that might allow him to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. But Ashley's expression had changed fundamentally during the course of the conversation. The deferential employee who'd been cowed by corporate policies was being replaced by someone who recognized that some responsibilities transcended job descriptions and organizational charts. "The cost," Derek said weakly, grasping for bureaucratic obstacles that might provide cover for his earlier decisions. Corporate approval, liability issues, warranty considerations. Mac's interruption was quiet, but absolute. "Mr. Sullivan, I need you to understand something very clearly. The cost of fixing the air conditioning is $3,200. The cost of not fixing it is considerably higher." The words carried implications that Derek desperately didn't want to explore. The thought of discrimination complaints, federal investigations, media attention, focused on a property management company that allowed elderly veterans to suffer during heat waves. All of it represented potential consequences that dwarfed any concerns about unauthorized expenditures. Chad finally found his voice, though it emerged as a nervous croak. "Maybe we should call Mr. Hawthorne, get his input on the situation." Richard Hawthorne was the building owner, a real estate investor who'd built his portfolio on the principle of maximum revenue extraction with minimum maintenance investment. Derek had learned to manage tenant complaints in ways that minimized costs and avoided bothering Hawthorne with what he considered operational details. Mac's response to Chad's suggestion was immediate and uncompromising. "By all means, call Mr. Hawthorne. I'd be very interested in his perspective on allowing military veterans and elderly residents to suffer heat-related medical emergencies, while air conditioning repairs are delayed for budget considerations." The suggestion carried the implicit threat of media attention and federal scrutiny, consequences that would extend far beyond Derek's immediate employment concerns. The idea of Richard Hawthorne having to explain his property management decisions to reporters or federal investigators was exactly the kind of exposure that real estate investors went to great lengths to avoid. Derek's phone began ringing again, the sharp sound cutting through the tension like an alarm. His earlier conference call had been missed, important people were waiting for responses, and his carefully managed schedule was disintegrating under the pressure of a situation he no longer controlled. But as Derek stared at the ringing phone, he realized that his other obligations had suddenly become secondary to the immediate crisis developing in his office. The comfortable world of property management, where tenant complaints could be deflected through bureaucratic processes and corporate policies, had been replaced by something far more serious and immediate. Mac watched Derek's internal struggle with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for others to reach inevitable conclusions. The veteran's calm certainty suggested that he'd been through similar confrontations before, situations where institutional authority had to be forced to meet its basic responsibilities to the people it was supposed to serve. Ashley stepped forward, her voice stronger now despite Derek's warning glare. "Mr. Sullivan, I can have Jimmy start the repairs this afternoon if you authorize the expenditure. The vendor is standing by, the parts are available, and we can have cooling restored to Building C by tomorrow morning." The offer represented a lifeline, a way for Derek to resolve the immediate crisis without completely abandoning his authority. But accepting it would require acknowledging that his earlier decisions had been wrong, that his comfortable assumptions about tenant management had been fundamentally flawed. Derek's hand hovered over his phone as he weighed his options: answer the call and attempt to return to his normal routine, pretending that nothing had changed, or acknowledge the reality that Mac Thompson had fundamentally altered the dynamics of power at Riverside Gardens apartment complex. The phone stopped ringing, the silence that followed somehow more ominous than the earlier tension. Derek's missed conference call represented more than just a scheduling inconvenience. It symbolized his loss of control over events that had been set in motion by forces he'd failed to recognize or understand. Mac reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew his notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. His pen moved across the paper with practiced efficiency, recording the date, time, and participants in what had clearly become an official documentation process. "For the record," Mac said as he wrote, "at 14:47 hours on July 15th, property manager Derek Sullivan was presented with documented evidence of habitability violations affecting 47 residential units. Emergency repair options were discussed, with costs and timelines clearly established. The formal tone and precise documentation transformed their confrontation into something that resembled a legal proceeding more than a tenant complaint." Derek realized that every word, every decision, every moment of delay was being recorded by someone who understood the value of evidence and the importance of creating an official record. Chad shifted nervously near the door, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Mr. Thompson, maybe we can work something out. Find a compromise that addresses everyone's concerns." Mac's response was immediate and uncompromising. "There's no compromise when it comes to basic human dignity. Mrs. Rodriguez either has air conditioning or she doesn't. The children in Building C either have safe living conditions or they don't. The elderly residents either receive the care they deserve or they don't." The stark simplicity of Mac's position eliminated any middle ground that Derek might have hoped to occupy. The comfortable world of corporate policies and bureaucratic delays had been replaced by a binary choice: meet basic responsibilities or face consequences that extended far beyond property management concerns. Ashley pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Jimmy Kowalski's number. "Jimmy, it's Ashley. Are you available to start the Building C repairs this afternoon?" "Yes. I know we've been waiting for authorization." "That's changing now." Derek watched helplessly as Ashley took control of the situation, authorizing expenditures and making commitments that he'd been delaying for days. His authority as property manager was being bypassed by an employee who'd found her conscience, and a tenant who carried credentials that placed him far outside normal tenant management relationships. The sound of activity outside the office window indicated that word was spreading through the complex. Jimmy Kowalski could be seen talking animatedly on his radio, coordinating with vendors, and preparing equipment for emergency repairs. Other residents were gathering in the courtyard, their expressions showing the first signs of hope they'd felt in days. Mac closed his notebook and returned it to his pocket, his documentation complete for now. When he looked up at Derek, his expression carried a weight that made the property manager's earlier threats seem pathetic and impotent. "Mr. Sullivan," Mac said quietly, "you have about 30 minutes to make the right choice. After that, this situation moves beyond your control entirely." The words carried the finality of an ultimatum delivered by someone who understood leverage and wasn't afraid to use it. Derek's comfortable assumptions about property management authority had been replaced by the stark reality that some people carried power that transcended corporate hierarchies and organizational charts. Outside the office, the Texas heat continued its relentless assault on Building C, but inside Derek Sullivan's climate-controlled sanctuary, the temperature had dropped considerably. The balance of power had shifted in ways that would determine not just the fate of the air conditioning repairs, but Derek's entire future in property management. The real test of his character was about to begin. The 30 minutes Derek Sullivan had been given felt like 30 seconds. Outside his office window, the complex had transformed into a hive of coordinated activity that operated entirely beyond his control. Jimmy Kowalski moved with renewed purpose, his radio crackling with communications from HVAC contractors who'd been standing by for days, waiting for authorization that had finally come from an unexpected source. Ashley Morgan had taken position at her desk like a field commander, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated emergency repairs, with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment throughout days of forced inaction. Her voice carried across the office with newfound authority as she spoke to vendors, building inspectors, and city officials who needed to be notified of the emergency work. Derek stood paralyzed behind his expensive desk, watching his carefully constructed world of property management authority crumble in real time. The conference call he'd missed had generated 3 follow-up calls from corporate headquarters, each message more urgent than the last. His supervisor wanted explanations for unauthorized expenditures that were already appearing in the company's financial systems. The building owner, Richard Hawthorne, had left a terse voicemail demanding immediate clarification of repair authorizations that hadn't followed proper approval channels. Mac Thompson remained exactly where he'd been throughout the confrontation, standing calmly in the center of the office with the patience of someone who'd watched more experienced adversaries collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. His presence filled the space in ways that expensive furniture and corporate decorations couldn't diminish, carrying an authority that derived from sources Derek was only beginning to understand. The phone on Derek's desk rang again, its sharp tone cutting through the tension like a blade. The caller ID showed Richard Hawthorne's private number, the building owner undoubtedly seeking explanations for repair authorizations that were already generating invoices and work orders. Derek's hand hovered over the receiver, knowing that answering would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give, while not answering would only delay an inevitable reckoning. Mac reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a second cell phone, this one different from the civilian device he'd been using earlier. The military-grade case and secure antenna suggested capabilities that extended far beyond normal communication needs. His fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, accessing contacts and systems that Derek couldn't begin to imagine. "Colonel Martinez," Mac said into the phone, his voice carrying the crisp formality of someone speaking to a superior officer. "This is Marcus Thompson. I need to report a situation requiring command attention." The words electrified the office atmosphere like lightning striking during a storm. Ashley looked up from her own phone conversation, her eyes wide with recognition of what she was witnessing. Chad had gone completely pale, finally understanding that Mac's earlier revelations had been just the beginning of a much larger story. Derek's throat went dry as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. Mac wasn't just a decorated veteran with impressive credentials. He was someone with active connections to military command structures, someone who could pick up a phone and reach officers whose authority extended far beyond civilian property management hierarchies. The conversation continued with military precision, Mac providing coordinates, situation reports, and documentation references, with the efficiency of someone who'd conducted similar briefings countless times before. Derek caught fragments of the discussion: civilian housing discrimination, veteran population affected, documented neglect of vulnerable residents, and potential federal violations requiring investigation. When Mac ended the call, the silence that followed carried the weight of decisions that had been set in motion at levels of authority Derek had never imagined confronting. The comfortable world of corporate policies and tenant management had been replaced by something far more serious, with consequences that would extend well beyond the immediate crisis at Riverside Gardens. Richard Hawthorne's call went to voicemail again, Derek's paralysis preventing him from answering questions he no longer had adequate responses for. Outside the office, Jimmy Kowalski's repair crew had arrived with equipment and materials, their professional efficiency suggesting that emergency work was already underway whether Derek authorized it or not. Ashley finished her coordination calls and turned toward Mac with an expression of profound respect. "Mr. Thompson, the emergency repairs are beginning now. We should have partial cooling restored to Building C within 4 hours, with full system functionality by tomorrow morning." Mac nodded his acknowledgement, but his attention remained focused on Derek, who stood frozen behind his desk like a defendant awaiting sentencing. The property manager's earlier confidence had been completely replaced by the dawning awareness that his comfortable assumptions about power and authority had been fundamentally wrong. "Mr. Sullivan," Mac said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of judgment delivered by someone who'd earned the right to make such assessments. "You had multiple opportunities to do the right thing. Mrs. Rodriguez didn't need to suffer. The families in Building C didn't need to endure unsafe conditions. The choice to prioritize budget considerations over human welfare was yours, and the consequences that follow will be yours as well." Derek's mouth opened to respond, to offer explanations or justifications that might somehow salvage his position, but no words emerged. The careful documentation in Mac's notebook, the federal connections he'd demonstrated, the systematic recording of every delay and excuse, had created an official record that would withstand any scrutiny Derek's corporate lawyers might attempt. The office door opened without warning, admitting two figures whose presence immediately transformed the atmosphere from tense confrontation to something approaching a military tribunal. The first was Colonel Sarah Martinez, a woman in her mid-40s, whose dress blues carried ribbons and insignia that spoke of service in places where decisions carried life and death consequences. Her silver oak leaves caught the fluorescent light as she surveyed the office with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating situations rapidly and accurately. Behind her stood a man in civilian clothes, whose bearing and alertness marked him unmistakably as active military, despite his business suit. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned respect through competence rather than rank, his eyes conducting a security sweep of the office that missed nothing important. Derek's legs nearly gave out as he processed what he was seeing. These weren't local officials or corporate representatives who might be managed through normal channels. These were federal military officers whose authority derived from institutions that made property management companies seem insignificant by comparison. Colonel Martinez approached Mac with the easy familiarity of someone greeting a trusted colleague. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying warmth that contrasted sharply with the formal efficiency she displayed upon entering. "I got your report. Walk me through the situation." The exchange that followed was conducted in the shorthand of military professionals who'd worked together in environments where precision and clarity could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Mac provided a concise briefing that covered the essential facts: vulnerable residents affected, documented delays in emergency repairs, property management decisions that prioritized profit over basic human welfare, and a pattern of discrimination that potentially violated federal housing protections for veterans. Ashley watched the proceedings with fascination and growing understanding. Her brother Jake had tried to explain the bonds forged between soldiers who'd served together in combat zones, but she'd never witnessed it firsthand. The easy professional respect between Mac and Colonel Martinez spoke of shared experiences that civilians could barely comprehend, of trust earned through circumstances where trust meant survival. Chad remained frozen near the door, his earlier smugness replaced by the growing awareness that he was witnessing events that would determine his professional future. The casual dismissal of tenant complaints that had seemed so routine just hours earlier now appeared as evidence of systematic neglect that could result in federal investigations and criminal charges. Colonel Martinez turned her attention to Derek, her assessment immediate and unforgiving. Years of command experience had taught her to recognize incompetence disguised as authority, to distinguish between leaders who accepted responsibility and administrators who hid behind bureaucratic processes. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made corporate titles seem insignificant. "I understand you've been delaying emergency repairs that affect the health and safety of military veterans and their families." Derek's response emerged as little more than a whisper. There were procedures, approval processes, budget considerations that required corporate authorization. Colonel Martinez's interruption was swift and absolute. "Mr. Sullivan, I don't care about your procedures. I care about the fact that decorated combat veterans are suffering heat-related medical emergencies while you debate budget approvals. That creates federal issues that extend far beyond your property management concerns." The words struck Derek like physical blows, each syllable carrying implications that threatened not just his employment, but his personal freedom. Federal housing discrimination charges, violations of veterans' rights protections, criminal neglect of vulnerable populations. All of it represented potential consequences that dwarfed any concerns about unauthorized expenditures or corporate approval processes. Staff Sergeant Johnson stepped forward, producing a tablet computer that displayed official forms and legal documents. "Sir, we'll need complete documentation of all maintenance requests, tenant complaints, and management responses related to Building C. We'll also require copies of all communications between property management and corporate headquarters regarding repair authorizations." The request was delivered with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to having such demands met without question. Derek realized that his comfortable world of selective record-keeping and plausible deniability had been replaced by federal investigation standards that would examine every decision with microscopic attention to detail. Ashley moved to her computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she compiled the requested documentation. "Colonel Martinez, I have maintenance logs, tenant complaint records, and email communications dating back to the initial air conditioning failure. I can have everything compiled within the hour." Her cooperation was immediate and complete, reflecting both professional competence and personal recognition that the moral weight of the situation demanded truth rather than institutional loyalty. Derek watched helplessly as his employee provided federal investigators with evidence that would document every moment of delay and every excuse that had prolonged resident suffering. Mac's notebook emerged again, its pages now representing not just personal documentation but potential evidence in federal proceedings that could result in criminal charges. The precise timestamps, detailed observations, and systematic recording of institutional failures had created an official record that would survive any legal challenge Derek's corporate lawyers might attempt. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Mac said, addressing Colonel Martinez directly. 73 years old, retired educator, heat-related medical emergency on July 12th. She's been rationing fluids and avoiding physical activity to cope with temperatures that exceed safety standards for elderly residents. Colonel Martinez's expression hardened as she processed the human cost of Derek's administrative delays. Military training had taught her to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, to accept responsibility for the welfare of people under her command, to understand that leadership meant making hard decisions when others preferred bureaucratic comfort. Derek's phone began ringing again, Richard Hawthorne's persistence finally overcoming his earlier hesitation. But as Derek reached for the receiver, Colonel Martinez's voice stopped him cold. "Mr. Sullivan, I wouldn't answer that call if I were you. Anything you say to building ownership at this point could complicate the federal investigation that's beginning right now." The words hit Derek like a physical blow, the realization that his situation had moved beyond property management discipline into federal criminal territory. The comfortable assumption that corporate lawyers could handle any problems through standard legal channels had been replaced by the stark reality of military investigators who operated according to entirely different standards of accountability. Staff Sergeant Johnson was already coordinating with other agencies, his secure communications equipment connecting him to federal housing authorities, veteran affairs investigators, and legal teams that specialized in discrimination cases involving military personnel. The scope of the investigation was expanding in real time, encompassing not just the immediate situation at Riverside Gardens, but potentially broader patterns of veteran mistreatment that could involve multiple properties and corporate entities. Jimmy Kowalski appeared in the office doorway, his work clothes sweat-stained, but his expression showing the first signs of satisfaction he'd felt in days. "Colonel, ma'am, we've got partial cooling restored to the first and second floors of Building C. Full system functionality should be online within 6 hours." Colonel Martinez nodded her acknowledgement, but her attention remained focused on Derek. "Mr. Sullivan, the emergency repairs are proceeding regardless of your authorization status. The question now is whether you're going to cooperate with the federal investigation or compound your legal problems through continued obstruction." Derek's world had collapsed so completely that cooperation seemed like his only remaining option. The corporate policies that had once provided him with comfortable authority now seemed like fragile shields against federal investigators who operated according to standards he'd never encountered. Ashley finished compiling the requested documentation, her efficiency reflecting both professional competence and personal commitment to ensuring that the truth would be fully revealed. "Colonel Martinez, I have comprehensive records of all tenant complaints, maintenance requests, and management responses. I've also included communications with corporate headquarters that document the decision-making process for repair authorizations." The evidence sheet assembled represented a complete record of institutional failure, documented with the kind of detail that would survive any legal challenge. Derek realized that his comfortable assumptions about plausible deniability and corporate protection had been systematically dismantled by employees who'd chosen conscience over institutional loyalty. Mac approached Derek's desk, his presence somehow larger and more authoritative than it had been even at the beginning of their confrontation. The patient tenant seeking help had been completely replaced by someone whose credentials and connections placed him far outside normal property management hierarchies. "Mr. Sullivan," Mac said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of judgment delivered by someone who'd earned the right to make such assessments. "Mrs. Rodriguez is comfortable now. The families in Building C will sleep safely tonight. The children will play in cool apartments tomorrow. That's what matters." The words carried both forgiveness and warning, acknowledgement that the immediate crisis had been resolved, while making clear that broader questions of accountability remained to be addressed. Derek understood that his professional future, and potentially his personal freedom, would depend on choices he made in the coming hours and days. Colonel Martinez gathered her materials, her mission accomplished, but her responsibilities continuing. "Mr. Sullivan, you'll be hearing from federal investigators within 48 hours. I strongly recommend that you consult with legal counsel who understands federal housing discrimination law, rather than relying on corporate attorneys who specialize in property management disputes." The distinction she made between different types of legal representation drove home the reality that Derek was facing consequences that extended far beyond normal business disputes. Federal criminal investigations followed different rules, carried different penalties, and required defense strategies that corporate lawyers weren't equipped to provide. As the military officers prepared to leave, Mac turned back toward Derek with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal disappointment. "Mr. Sullivan, you had the resources to solve this problem on day one. You had the authority to prevent suffering that lasted nearly a week. The choice to prioritize budget concerns over human welfare was yours, and history will remember how you used that authority." The words carried the finality of a professional assessment delivered by someone who'd seen leadership tested under the most demanding circumstances possible. Derek understood that he'd been weighed, measured, and found fundamentally lacking in the qualities that distinguish genuine authority from mere administrative power. Ashley approached Mac as the confrontation reached its conclusion, her expression showing profound respect, mixed with lingering amazement at what she'd witnessed. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for standing up for Mrs. Rodriguez and the other residents. I should have found the courage to act sooner." Mac's response was gentle, but uncompromising. "Ashley, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing, despite the fear. You found yours when it mattered most." The exchange between them carried the warmth of mutual respect between people who'd discovered their moral center under pressure. Ashley had transformed from a corporate employee following institutional policies into someone who understood that some responsibilities transcended job descriptions and organizational loyalty. Outside the office window, the late afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the Texas horizon, but the oppressive heat that had dominated the day was finally yielding to the artificial cooling being restored throughout Building C. Jimmy Kowalski's repair crews worked with professional efficiency, their efforts representing more than just mechanical restoration, but a return to basic human dignity for residents who'd suffered unnecessarily. Mac gathered his documentation, his mission accomplished, but his broader responsibilities continuing. The notebook that had recorded Derek's failures would now become part of federal case files that could prevent similar suffering at other properties owned by corporations that prioritized profit over basic human welfare. Derek remained behind his desk as the others prepared to leave, his expensive office furniture and corporate decorations now seeming pathetic and insignificant compared to the authority carried by people who'd earned respect through service rather than organizational hierarchy. His comfortable world of property management power had been revealed as hollow and vulnerable when confronted by individuals who operated according to principles he'd never bothered to understand. Colonel Martinez paused at the office door, her final words carrying the weight of military justice delivered by someone who'd spent her career protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "Mr. Sullivan, genuine authority comes from accepting responsibility for the welfare of people under your care. You had that authority and chose not to use it. The consequences that follow are the natural result of that choice." As the military officers left the building, their presence had transformed not just the immediate crisis, but the fundamental dynamics of power at Riverside Gardens apartment complex. The corporate hierarchy that had once seemed unassailable had been revealed as fragile and vulnerable when confronted by people who carried authority derived from service, sacrifice, and genuine commitment to protecting others. Ashley returned to her desk with renewed purpose, her phone already ringing with calls from residents who'd heard about the emergency repairs and wanted to express their gratitude. The community that Derek had viewed as a collection of revenue sources was revealing itself as a network of mutual support and shared responsibility that operated according to principles he'd never bothered to recognize. Chad finally found his voice as the office settled into an uneasy quiet. "Mr. Sullivan, what do we tell corporate headquarters about the unauthorized expenditures?" Derek's response emerged as a hollow laugh that carried no humor whatsoever. "Chad, I don't think corporate expenditure policies are our biggest concern anymore. The reality of federal investigations, criminal charges, and civil rights violations had replaced Derek's comfortable world of corporate bureaucracy with consequences that extended far beyond normal business disputes. His authority as property manager, once seemingly absolute within the narrow confines of tenant relations, had been revealed as insignificant when measured against the broader standards of justice and accountability that governed a civilized society. Outside Building C, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez stood in her doorway for the first time in days, breathing cool air that carried the promise of comfortable sleep and safe refuge from the oppressive Texas heat. Her gratitude wasn't directed toward Derek Sullivan or corporate policies, but toward a neighbor who'd understood that some responsibilities transcended lease agreements and rental relationships. The transformation of Riverside Gardens apartment complex was complete, but the broader implications of what had occurred would resonate far beyond a single property management crisis. Mac Thompson had demonstrated that authority derived from service could overcome institutional power based on hierarchy, that individual courage could challenge systemic indifference, and that justice delayed was not justice denied when people of principle refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The story that had begun with a simple request for air conditioning repairs had become something far more significant. A demonstration that in America, where principles mattered more than profit, where service counted more than status, where human dignity transcended corporate convenience, the right person asking the right questions at the right time could still change everything. Derek Sullivan sat alone in his climate-controlled office, surrounded by the debris of authority that had crumbled under scrutiny, facing a future that would be determined not by corporate policies, but by federal prosecutors, who specialized in cases where institutional power had been abused at the expense of those who'd served their country with honor. The real reckoning was just beginning, but for the residents of Building C, the immediate battle had been won by someone who understood that true strength came not from holding power over others, but from using whatever authority you possessed to protect those who needed protection most. 3 weeks after the confrontation that changed everything at Riverside Gardens apartment complex, Derek Sullivan sat in the sterile waiting room of the Travis County Federal Building, his expensive suit wrinkled from nervous perspiration, despite the aggressive air conditioning that kept the government facility at a precisely regulated 68 degrees. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now found comfort in the very climate control he'd denied to dozens of residents during the July heatwave that had ended his career and potentially his freedom. The manila folder in his lap contained documents that represented the complete dismantling of his professional life. Termination papers from Hawthorne Property Management had arrived by certified mail just 48 hours after Colonel Martinez's visit, followed immediately by civil lawsuits filed on behalf of every resident of Building C. Richard Hawthorne had wasted no time distancing his company from Derek's decisions, publicly announcing new policies for emergency repairs and veteran resident protections that read like a direct refutation of everything Derek had done. Across the waiting room, Rebecca Chen reviewed her notes with the methodical precision of someone who'd built her reputation on cases exactly like this one. The veterans' rights attorney had taken on Marcus Thompson's discrimination complaint pro bono, not because she needed the work, but because the documented evidence of institutional neglect was so comprehensive that it represented an opportunity to establish legal precedents that would protect military families throughout Texas. Derek's lawyer, a nervous corporate attorney named Michael Prescott, who specialized in property management disputes, sat beside his client with the hunted expression of someone who'd discovered that his usual strategies were completely inadequate for federal civil rights litigation. The comfortable world of lease agreements and tenant relations had been replaced by federal statutes, constitutional protections, and criminal penalties that Prescott had studied in law school but never expected to confront in practice. The federal building security procedures had been Derek's first indication that this wasn't going to be a routine legal proceeding. Metal detectors, background checks, armed federal marshals, and classification protocols that suggested national security implications far beyond typical housing discrimination cases. When Derek had asked Prescott about the unusual security measures, the lawyer had gone pale while explaining that Marcus Thompson's military record contained classified elements that required special handling, even in civilian legal proceedings. The waiting room door opened with the electronic buzz of a high-security facility, admitting Marcus Thompson and Colonel Sarah Martinez. Mac wore a simple business suit that couldn't quite conceal the bearing and alertness that marked him as someone accustomed to dangerous environments. His presence filled the space with the same quiet authority Derek remembered from their confrontation, but now it was enhanced by the confidence of someone who'd been vindicated by subsequent events. Colonel Martinez carried herself with the crisp efficiency of a military officer conducting official business, her uniform bearing new ribbons that suggested recent commendations for service beyond her normal duties. The folder in her hands was marked with classification stamps and federal seals that made Derek's corporate documents seem pathetic by comparison. Rebecca Chen stood to greet her clients, her expression showing the satisfaction of an attorney who'd assembled an airtight case from evidence that documented every moment of Derek's institutional failures. The 3 weeks since the initial complaint had been spent gathering testimony from residents, medical records from heat-related emergencies, maintenance logs that proved repair capabilities had been available throughout the crisis, and communications records that showed Derek's deliberate delays despite clear knowledge of resident suffering. "Mr. Thompson," Rebecca said, her voice carrying professional warmth mixed with genuine respect, "the federal mediator is ready to begin proceedings. Given the strength of our documentation and the defendant's obvious liability, I expect this to be resolved quickly." Mac's response was measured and precise, reflecting someone who understood that legal victory was less important than ensuring such situations never occurred again. "Rebecca, my primary concern remains the protection of other veteran families who might face similar discrimination. Whatever financial settlement emerges from this proceeding should include systemic changes that prevent property management companies from using bureaucratic delays to avoid their basic responsibilities." The exchange made Derek realize that Mac's motivations extended far beyond personal vindication or financial compensation. This wasn't just about the air conditioning crisis at Riverside Gardens. It was about establishing legal precedents and corporate accountability measures that would protect military veterans and their families throughout the region. Prescott leaned toward Derek, his voice a nervous whisper that carried clearly in the acoustically perfect federal waiting room. "Derek, they're not just seeking damages for the Building C residents. They're asking for injunctive relief that would require federal oversight of all Hawthorne properties, criminal referrals for willful neglect of vulnerable populations, and personal liability findings that could result in your permanent disbarment from property management positions." The scope of potential consequences hit Derek like a physical blow. He'd assumed that losing his job and facing some financial penalties would represent the extent of his problems, but the federal system operated according to standards that made corporate discipline seem insignificant. Criminal charges, federal monitoring, personal liability that could follow him for the rest of his professional life. All of it stemming from decisions he'd made during a single week in July. The electronic door buzzed again, admitting federal mediator Patricia Williams, whose presence immediately transformed the atmosphere from tense waiting to formal legal proceedings. Judge Williams had spent 15 years handling civil rights cases involving military personnel, and her reputation for thorough investigation and uncompromising standards had made her the obvious choice for a case with such clear documentation of institutional discrimination. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Williams announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "we'll be conducting these proceedings in Conference Room Alpha, which has been cleared for the classified elements of Mr. Thompson's service record that pertain to this case." The mention of classified information sent another wave of anxiety through Derek's nervous system. He'd assumed that Mac's military background was simply a matter of impressive credentials and federal connections, But the reality of security clearances and classified service records suggested involvement in operations that Derek couldn't begin to understand. Conference Room Alpha was a study in federal efficiency, all neutral colors and high-tech equipment that suggested capabilities for secure communications and document handling. The long table was arranged to emphasize the formal nature of the proceedings, with federal seals and American flags that reminded everyone present that this wasn't a typical civil dispute, but a matter of constitutional rights and federal law. Judge Williams took her position at the head of the table, her materials arranged with military precision that spoke of someone who understood the importance of thorough preparation. Before we begin formal mediation, I want to establish the scope of this proceeding. Mr. Thompson, you're alleging systematic discrimination based on veteran status, willful neglect of vulnerable populations, and violation of federal housing protections. Mr. Sullivan, you're represented by counsel in both civil and potential criminal proceedings. Is this understanding correct? Both parties confirmed their positions, Derek's voice barely audible, while Mac spoke with the clear confidence of someone who'd testified in far more challenging circumstances. The formal acknowledgement of potential criminal charges made Derek's hands shake, as he realized that his comfortable assumptions about corporate legal protection had been completely wrong. Rebecca Chen opened her presentation with photographic evidence that made Derek's earlier justifications seem obscene. Pictures of Mrs. Elena Rodriguez's apartment during the heat wave, showing temperatures that exceeded safety standards for elderly residents. Medical records from the emergency room visits that had resulted from Derek's delays. Maintenance logs that proved repair capabilities had been available throughout the crisis, while Derek created bureaucratic obstacles to avoid spending money. Your Honor, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd seen institutional power abused at the expense of people who deserved better. The evidence shows a pattern of deliberate indifference to the health and safety of military veterans and their families. Mr. Sullivan had multiple opportunities to authorize emergency repairs that would have cost less than one day's rent revenue from the affected building, but chose instead to prioritize corporate budget concerns over basic human dignity. The photographs were devastating in their stark documentation of unnecessary suffering. Children's rooms that registered temperatures dangerous for developing bodies. Elderly residents rationing water and avoiding physical activity to cope with heat that approached dangerous levels. Medical equipment in veteran families' apartments that couldn't function properly in the extreme temperatures Derek's delays had created. Judge Williams examined each piece of evidence with the methodical attention of someone who understood that federal civil rights cases required documentation that would survive appellate review and set binding precedents. Her questions were precise and unforgiving, designed to establish the legal foundations that would make this case a landmark for veteran housing protections. Mr. Chen, Judge Williams said, addressing Rebecca directly, walk me through the timeline of Mr. Sullivan's decision-making process. I want to understand exactly when he became aware of the health risks and what alternatives were available to him at each stage of the crisis. Rebecca's presentation was devastating in its precision. July 9th. Initial system failure reported with immediate repair recommendations. July 10th. Cost estimates provided showing minimal financial impact. July 11th. Residents' petition delivered with clear documentation of vulnerable populations affected. July 12th. First medical emergency directly related to heat exposure. July 13th. Families forced to relocate children due to unsafe conditions. July 14th. Maintenance supervisor's urgent request for emergency authorization. Each date in the timeline represented a decision point where Derek could have chosen human welfare over corporate convenience, but had consistently chosen delay, deflection, and bureaucratic obstruction instead. The pattern of callous indifference was so clear that even Prescott stopped taking notes, recognizing that his client's position was legally indefensible. Colonel Martinez's testimony provided the military context that elevated the case from simple housing discrimination to federal civil rights violation. Her explanation of Mac's service record, carefully edited to protect classified information while establishing his credibility and community standing, painted a picture of someone who dedicated his life to protecting others and deserved better treatment from civilian institutions. "Your Honor," Colonel Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of command authority earned through years of military service. Staff Sergeant Thompson served 3 tours in Afghanistan, including classified operations that resulted in the protection of American lives and strategic objectives. His decorations include the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Army Commendation Medal with V device for Valor Under Fire. The idea that someone with his service record would be subjected to housing discrimination by a civilian property manager represents exactly the kind of institutional failure that federal civil rights protections were designed to prevent. The contrast between Mac's military service and Derek's corporate excuses was so stark that it seemed almost unfair. Someone who'd risked his life protecting American interests overseas had been forced to endure bureaucratic indifference from someone whose primary concern was avoiding minor expenditures that might affect his performance bonus. Derek's opportunity to present his defense was a disaster from the beginning. Prescott's attempts to characterize the delays as reasonable business practices were immediately challenged by Judge Williams, who'd seen similar justifications in dozens of civil rights cases and understood exactly how institutional discrimination operated through bureaucratic processes. "Mr. Prescott," Judge Williams said, her tone carrying the skeptical authority of someone who'd heard every possible excuse for institutional discrimination, "are you seriously arguing that a decorated combat veteran should accept unsafe living conditions because your client was concerned about corporate approval processes?" Prescott's response was weak and unconvincing, relying on technical arguments about lease provisions and corporate policies that seemed pathetic when measured against the human costs of Derek's decisions. The lawyer's obvious discomfort with federal civil rights law made his defense seem incompetent and ill-prepared for the seriousness of the charges. Derek's personal testimony was even worse. His attempts to justify the delays through corporate policy explanations were systematically dismantled by Rebecca's precise questions about alternative actions he could have taken at every stage of the crisis. His claim that budget considerations required careful deliberation was destroyed by evidence showing that the repair costs represented less than 1 day's revenue from the affected building. "Mr. Sullivan," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the controlled intensity of someone who'd built her career on cases exactly like this one, "you've testified that corporate policies required extensive approval processes for emergency expenditures. But didn't those same policies include provisions for immediate action when resident health and safety were at risk?" Derek's response was evasive and unconvincing, his obvious discomfort with the truth making his corporate justifications seem hollow and self-serving. Every answer he gave created new contradictions that Rebecca exploited with surgical precision, building a record that would support not just civil liability but potential criminal referrals. Judge Williams called a recess after Derek's testimony, but the outcome was already clear to everyone in the room. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal precedents were unambiguous, and Derek's explanations had only made his position worse by revealing the deliberate nature of his indifference to resident welfare. During the break, Prescott made desperate attempts to negotiate a settlement that might avoid the most serious consequences, but Rebecca's terms were uncompromising. Full financial compensation for all affected residents, personal liability findings that would prevent Derek from working in property management again, federal monitoring of all Hawthorne properties, and criminal referrals to federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights violations. "Michael," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards, "your client had multiple opportunities to resolve this situation through simple human decency. Now he gets to face the full consequences of choosing corporate convenience over basic constitutional rights." When proceedings resumed, Judge Williams delivered her findings with the methodical precision of someone establishing legal precedents that would protect military families throughout the federal district. The civil rights violations were clear and unambiguous. The evidence of deliberate indifference was overwhelming, and the potential for criminal charges was substantial enough to warrant immediate referral to federal prosecutors. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority backed by constitutional principles, "your decisions during the July heat wave represent exactly the kind of institutional discrimination that federal civil rights protections were designed to prevent. The evidence shows deliberate indifference to the health and safety of military veterans and their families, systematic abuse of bureaucratic processes to avoid basic responsibilities, and willful neglect of vulnerable populations that rises to the level of criminal conduct. The formal findings were devastating in their scope and implications. Personal liability for all damages, permanent disbarment from property management positions, federal monitoring requirements for any future employment involving vulnerable populations, and immediate referral to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation. Derek's world collapsed completely as he processed the full extent of his consequences. His career was over, his financial future was destroyed, and his personal freedom was threatened by criminal charges that could result in federal prison time. All of it stemming from a simple decision to delay air conditioning repairs because he didn't want to spend company money without proper authorization. Mac's response to the victory was characteristically measured and focused on broader implications rather than personal vindication. Your Honor, I appreciate the court's recognition that military veterans deserve better treatment from civilian institutions. My hope is that this case will establish precedents that prevent other families from experiencing the discrimination and neglect that occurred at Riverside Gardens. The formal conclusion of proceedings was followed by media attention that Derek had never anticipated. Local television stations covered the story as an example of corporate accountability and veteran rights protections, while national news outlets picked up the case as evidence of systematic problems in property management industry practices. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez was interviewed for the evening news, her gratitude toward Mac evident as she described the difference between suffering in dangerous heat and sleeping comfortably in her own home. Marcus Thompson is a hero, she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood that heroism came in many forms, not just for his military service, but for caring enough about his neighbors to fight for what was right. The settlement funds were distributed to affected residents within 30 days, but the broader changes to property management practices throughout Texas would take years to fully implement. Federal monitoring requirements, enhanced veteran protections, and criminal penalties for housing discrimination created a new framework that made Derek's casual indifference to resident welfare legally impossible. Ashley Morgan was promoted to property manager at Riverside Gardens, her conscience and competence during the crisis, earning recognition from both residents and corporate leadership. Her first official action was implementing emergency repair protocols that prioritized resident welfare over budget considerations, ensuring that no family would ever again suffer while bureaucratic processes delayed basic maintenance. Jimmy Kowalski received a commendation from the city of Austin for his persistent advocacy on behalf of residents during the heatwave crisis. His detailed maintenance logs and urgent repair requests had provided crucial documentation that supported the federal case, proving that solutions had been available throughout Derek's delays. Chad Brennan found new employment in retail management, his experience with Derek's discriminatory practices making him unemployable in property management, but providing valuable lessons about the difference between authority and leadership that would serve him well in future positions. 6 months after the federal mediation, Derek Sullivan was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations, his case establishing legal precedents that would protect military families throughout the United States. The judge's sentencing statement emphasized that positions of authority carried corresponding responsibilities that couldn't be avoided through corporate policy justifications. Mac Thompson continued his quiet work as a veteran advocate, his success at Riverside Gardens leading to consultation opportunities with property management companies throughout Texas, who wanted to avoid similar federal investigations. His approach remained the same: patient documentation, thorough preparation, and uncompromising commitment to ensuring that people who'd served their country received the respect and dignity their service had earned. The apartment complex itself was transformed by the changes that followed Derek's downfall. New management policies prioritized resident welfare, emergency repair protocols ensured immediate response to health and safety issues, and veteran families found themselves part of a community that understood and appreciated their service rather than viewing them as potential problems to be managed. Colonel Martinez received a commendation for her role in supporting civilian veteran rights, her intervention at Riverside Gardens representing exactly the kind of military-civilian cooperation that ensured service members received proper treatment in their communities. Her report on the case became required reading at military bases throughout the region, educating service members about their housing rights and available resources. The broader implications of the Riverside Gardens case extended far beyond a single property management crisis. Federal housing authorities used the precedent to investigate similar patterns of discrimination at properties throughout the Southwest, resulting in dozens of additional cases and systematic reforms that protected military families across multiple states. Derek's personal story became a cautionary tale in property management training programs, his fall from corporate authority to federal prison illustrating the consequences of mistaking bureaucratic power for genuine leadership. Business schools used the case to teach students about the difference between legal compliance and ethical responsibility, emphasizing that institutional authority carried corresponding obligations that couldn't be avoided through policy justifications. The transformation of Riverside Gardens from a place where military families faced discrimination to a model community for veteran housing became a source of regional pride. Mac Thompson's quiet heroism had not only resolved an immediate crisis, but created lasting changes that would protect countless families who deserved better treatment from the civilian institutions they'd sworn to defend. Years later, when new residents moved into Building C, they would sleep comfortably in climate-controlled apartments, unaware of the suffering that had once occurred there or the quiet courage that had transformed their community. But Mrs. Elena Rodriguez remembered, and she made sure that Marcus Thompson's story was told to anyone willing to listen, ensuring that genuine heroism would be recognized, even when it preferred to remain in the shadows. The lesson was simple but profound. In a society that claimed to honor military service, true respect was measured not by rhetoric or ceremonies, but by the daily treatment veterans received from the civilian institutions they'd served to protect. At Riverside Gardens apartment complex, that lesson had been learned the hard way, but learned completely, creating a legacy that would endure long after the individuals involved had moved on to other challenges and other victories. 2 years had passed since the federal courthouse doors closed on Derek Sullivan's sentencing, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed landscape of Riverside Gardens apartment complex. The same Texas heat that had once been a weapon of neglect now served as a reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when the right person refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Marcus Thompson stood on the balcony of his apartment in Building C, watching the daily rhythm of a community that had learned to take care of its own. The morning air carried the sounds of children playing safely in climate-controlled comfort, elderly residents moving freely without fear of heat-related medical emergencies, and maintenance crews conducting their work with the pride of people whose efforts were valued rather than delayed by bureaucratic indifference. The apartment itself had become something more than just a place to live. Mac had transformed the spare bedroom into an informal office where veteran families could seek advice on housing rights, disability benefits, and civilian career transitions. The walls were covered with thank you letters from military families throughout Texas who'd benefited from the legal precedents established during his confrontation with Derek Sullivan's discriminatory practices. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez knocked softly on the door, her Tuesday morning visits having become a cherished routine that neither of them would have traded for anything. At 75, she moved with the energy of someone who no longer worried about rationing her strength to cope with unsafe living conditions. Her smile carried the warmth of someone who understood that heroism often wore ordinary clothes and preferred quiet action to public recognition. "Mijo," she said, using the affectionate term that had become her standard greeting. "I brought you fresh coffee and some news that I think you'll want to hear." Mac opened the door with genuine pleasure, their friendship having deepened into the kind of intergenerational bond that enriched both their lives. Elena had become more than just a neighbor. She was a connection to the community values that had motivated his military service and continued to guide his civilian advocacy work. The news she carried was a copy of the Austin American-Statesman, folded to an article about the expansion of federal veteran housing protections that had grown out of the Riverside Gardens case. The headline read, "Military Family Housing Rights Expanded Statewide," with a subheading that mentioned the legal precedents established through Mac's successful discrimination lawsuit. They're calling it the Thompson standard, Elena said, her voice carrying the pride of someone who'd witnessed history being made in her own neighborhood. Federal housing authorities are requiring property management companies throughout Texas to implement emergency repair protocols that prioritize resident welfare over budget considerations. Mac read the article with the careful attention he'd always given to mission briefings, understanding that media coverage represented public accountability that would help prevent other families from experiencing the discrimination he'd confronted. The Thompson standard required property managers to authorize emergency repairs within 24 hours, when health and safety issues affected vulnerable populations, with federal penalties for bureaucratic delays that resulted in resident suffering. The article included interviews with other military families who'd faced similar discrimination at properties throughout the region, their stories revealing a pattern of institutional indifference that Mac's victory had helped expose and eliminate. Property management companies were implementing new training programs, federal oversight procedures, and victim compensation funds that transformed housing discrimination from a profitable strategy into a financially catastrophic liability. Ashley Morgan appeared in the newspaper as well, her promotion to regional property manager having made her a spokesperson for industry reforms that prioritized resident welfare over corporate convenience. Her quote in the article captured the fundamental change in perspective that Mac's case had created. "We've learned that treating residents with dignity and respect isn't just morally right, it's essential for long-term business success. The Thompson standard has made us better managers and better human beings." The transformation of Ashley's career represented one of the most satisfying outcomes of the entire confrontation. Her courage in supporting emergency repairs despite Derek's threats had earned recognition from corporate leadership, who understood that employee integrity was more valuable than blind loyalty to flawed policies. She'd become a model for property managers throughout Texas, proving that conscience and competence could coexist in business environments that had previously rewarded indifference and obstruction. Jimmy Kowalski had also benefited from the changes, his detailed maintenance documentation during the crisis, earning him promotion to facilities director for the entire Hawthorne property portfolio. His new position gave him authority to implement emergency repair protocols without bureaucratic interference, ensuring that his technical expertise could be applied immediately when resident welfare was at stake. The article mentioned that Chad Brennan had found employment in nonprofit management, his experience with Derek's discriminatory practices having taught him valuable lessons about the difference between authority and leadership. His new role, working with veteran services organizations, had given him opportunities to make positive contributions that helped repair the damage caused by his earlier complicity in institutional discrimination. Mac folded the newspaper carefully, recognizing that media attention represented public accountability that would help prevent other families from experiencing similar discrimination. But his satisfaction came less from personal recognition than from evidence that systematic changes were protecting military families throughout the region. Elena settled into her usual chair on the balcony, her presence transforming Mac's apartment into an informal community center where neighbors could share news, seek advice, and maintain the social connections that made Riverside Gardens feel like home rather than just a place to pay rent. Her kitchen wisdom and Mac's military experience had proven to be a powerful combination for solving problems that required both practical knowledge and strategic thinking. "I heard from my nephew in San Antonio," Elena said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice expand beyond their immediate community. His apartment complex had a similar situation with delayed repairs, but the property manager authorized emergency work immediately when the residents mentioned the Thompson standard. No bureaucratic delays, no corporate excuses, just immediate action to fix the problem. The ripple effects of Mac's case continued to spread throughout Texas and beyond, creating a network of protection that extended far beyond the original residents of Building C. Federal housing authorities were using the Riverside Gardens precedent to investigate similar patterns of discrimination in other states, while military legal assistance offices were training service members about their housing rights and available resources for addressing institutional neglect. Mac's phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca Chen, the veterans' rights attorney who'd handled his discrimination case. The message included a link to a federal court decision from Colorado that cited the Thompson standard in a ruling that protected military families from retaliatory evictions after reporting maintenance violations. The legal precedent was expanding beyond Texas, creating nationwide protections that would benefit countless families who deserved better treatment from civilian institutions. The financial aspects of the settlement had long been resolved, with affected residents receiving compensation that acknowledged the suffering they'd endured during Derek's deliberate delays. But Mac had donated most of his portion to veteran housing advocacy organizations, understanding that systematic change was more valuable than personal enrichment. His military pension and disability benefits provided adequate financial security, while his real satisfaction came from knowing that other families wouldn't face similar discrimination. Elena's grandchildren had visited during their summer vacation, their comfortable stay in Building C representing a stark contrast to the previous year when elderly residents had been forced to relocate during heat waves because property managers prioritized budget concerns over basic human dignity. The children's laughter and climate-controlled apartments served as a daily reminder of what had been accomplished through patient persistence and unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The complex itself had become a model for veteran-friendly housing throughout the Austin area. New residents were attracted by management policies that prioritized community welfare, maintenance procedures that addressed problems immediately, and a sense of mutual respect that made Riverside Gardens feel like the kind of place military families deserved after years of service to their country. Mac's informal role as a veteran advocate had expanded beyond housing issues to include disability benefits, civilian career transitions, and family support services that helped former military personnel navigate the challenges of post-service life. His apartment had become an unofficial resource center where veterans could find guidance, support, and practical assistance from someone who understood both military culture and civilian systems. The morning routine continued with Mac reviewing emails from veteran families throughout the region who'd contacted him for advice on housing discrimination, maintenance disputes, and tenant rights issues. His responses were always measured and practical, reflecting someone who understood that sustainable change came through patient education and systematic documentation, rather than confrontational tactics that might generate publicity but fail to create lasting improvements. One email particularly caught his attention, from a young Army sergeant at Fort Hood whose family was facing delayed repairs to their apartment's heating system as winter approached. The sergeant had documented the delays, researched his rights under the Thompson standard, and was seeking advice on how to approach his property manager without escalating the situation unnecessarily. Mac's response was thorough and practical, explaining the legal protections available under federal housing statutes, while emphasizing the importance of maintaining detailed records and attempting resolution through established channels before considering formal complaints. His advice reflected years of experience with situations where patience and preparation were more effective than immediate confrontation. Elena watched him work with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that true leadership often happened in private moments, when no one was watching, except the people who needed help most. Her own background as an educator had taught her to recognize the difference between people who sought attention and those who sought results, and Mac clearly belonged in the latter category. The balcony conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, Ashley Morgan arriving for one of her periodic visits to check on resident satisfaction and discuss community improvements. Her transformation from corporate employee following institutional policies to community leader prioritizing resident welfare had made these visits genuinely meaningful rather than bureaucratic formalities. "Mr. Thompson," Ashley said, her voice carrying the respect of someone who'd learned valuable lessons about conscience and competence during their shared confrontation with Derek's discriminatory practices. "I wanted to update you on the new resident orientation program we're implementing. We're including information about tenant rights, maintenance request procedures, and federal protections for military families." The orientation program represented exactly the kind of systematic change that Mac had hoped would result from his legal victory. Instead of leaving new residents to discover their rights through trial and error, property management was proactively educating them about available protections and proper procedures for addressing problems before they became crises. Ashley's briefing included statistics that demonstrated the effectiveness of the Thompson standard in preventing housing discrimination throughout the region. Emergency repair response times had improved dramatically, resident satisfaction surveys showed significant increases in trust and communication, and property management companies were reporting better long-term financial performance due to reduced turnover and legal costs. The conversation expanded to include broader community development initiatives that would make Riverside Gardens even more veteran-friendly. Plans for a community garden tended by residents, expanded recreational facilities that accommodated disabilities, and educational programs that helped military families transition to civilian life while maintaining the mutual support networks that had sustained them during their service years. Mac's input on these initiatives reflected his understanding that sustainable community development required input from residents, rather than top-down planning by corporate managers who might not understand the specific needs of military families. His suggestions were practical and thoughtful, drawing on his experience with both military logistics and civilian advocacy work. Elena contributed her own perspectives based on decades of community involvement, her wisdom about neighborhood dynamics proving invaluable for planning initiatives that would strengthen social connections rather than creating new sources of conflict or division. Her ability to bridge generational and cultural differences made her insights particularly valuable for creating inclusive programs that serve diverse resident populations. The planning session concluded with commitments for ongoing collaboration that would ensure resident voices remain central to community development decisions. Ashley's management approach had evolved to prioritize consultation and consensus building over corporate efficiency, reflecting lessons learned during the crisis that had transformed everyone involved. As Ashley prepared to leave, she paused to express gratitude that went beyond professional courtesy. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that working with you during the Derek Sullivan situation taught me more about leadership and integrity than everything I learned in business school. The changes we've implemented here have made me a better manager and a better person." Mac's response was characteristically modest, deflecting personal credit while acknowledging the collective effort that had created lasting improvements for military families throughout the region. "Ashley, you found your courage when it mattered most. That's what leadership really looks like, doing the right thing even when it's difficult or risky." The afternoon progressed with Mac reviewing case updates from Rebecca Chen's law office, federal agencies implementing Thompson's standard requirements, and veteran advocacy organizations throughout Texas that were using his legal victory as a foundation for their own efforts to protect military families from institutional discrimination. Each update represented evidence that his confrontation with Derek Sullivan had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the original air conditioning crisis at Building C. Property management companies were implementing new training programs, federal oversight procedures were protecting vulnerable populations, and military families were receiving the respect and dignity their service had earned. Elena remained on the balcony as the sun moved across the Texas sky, her presence providing the kind of intergenerational wisdom that enriched Mac's perspective on community development and social justice issues. Their friendship had become a model for the kind of mutual support networks that made communities stronger and more resilient. The day concluded with Mac updating his advocacy files, documenting new cases, and tracking the progress of systematic reforms that would protect military families for years to come. His work remained largely invisible to public attention, but its impact was measured in families who slept safely in their homes, elderly residents who received prompt medical attention, and children who played in climate-controlled comfort because someone had refused to accept institutional indifference as inevitable. The transformation of Riverside Gardens apartment complex from a place where military families faced discrimination to a model community for veteran housing had become a source of regional pride and national recognition. Mac Thompson's quiet heroism had not only resolved an immediate crisis but created lasting changes that would protect countless families who deserved better treatment from the civilian institutions they'd sworn to defend. As evening approached and the Texas heat began to subside, Mac stood once more on his balcony, watching the daily rhythm of a community that had learned to take care of its own. The same apartment building, where he'd once faced bureaucratic indifference, had become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept injustice and worked together to create something better. The legacy of his confrontation with Derek Sullivan would continue long after the individuals involved had moved on to other challenges and other victories. The Thompson Standard would protect military families throughout the United States. Federal housing protections would prevent discrimination based on veteran status, and property management companies would understand that treating residents with dignity and respect wasn't just morally right but essential for long-term success. But for Mac Thompson, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that Mrs. Elena Rodriguez would sleep comfortably in her own home, that children would play safely in climate-controlled apartments, and that military families would receive the respect their service had earned. That was what victory really looked like. Not personal recognition or financial compensation, but systematic changes that made life better for people who deserved better treatment from the world they'd served to protect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.